Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm coming to you with a November wrap-up, part 1. Look at me. So I haven't been doing these part 1, part 2 wrap-ups, but I've actually finished 4 books so far this month, and rather than deal with the monstrosity that is like an hour-long wrap-up, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do a mid-month wrap-up, and I can deal with whatever I end up reading at the end of the month, you know, at the second half. I don't know if I'll necessarily finish 4 more books by the end of November, but I have been on a pretty decent roll. Thank you, Nonfiction November. And I feel like with like the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States and things like that, I'll have some extra time and I might get a little bit more reading done than I usually do. But I feel like the combination of like Nonfiction November, along with it getting colder outside and therefore me not wanting to go outside as much and it like getting like pitch black at like 4 p.m. So I'm not going on my evening walks and things like that. Like I'm basically reading more than I have been recently. And so, yeah, I'm going to do a mid-month wrap-up. Now, not all of the books that I haven't read so far this month have been books that I picked out in my Nonfiction November TBR. I am still working through my TBR, but I decided that I wanted to intersperse fiction books with my nonfiction books so that way I didn't burn out. And I actually think that's been helping a lot, at least for me personally. Like, obviously, I enjoy nonfiction, but reading like too much of like one genre or style or anything like that can really like burden me personally, and especially because nonfiction generally takes me a little bit longer to read, I can still have some like momentum and things like that by picking up like fast-paced fiction books. So I'll be going through the 4 books specifically that I finished so far this month. So first I picked up The Undocumented Americans by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. This is partially a memoir, partially like a modern history sort of thing, kind of just talking about undocumented Americans here in the United States. The writer herself was on DACA when she decided that she wanted to change the narrative on how people talk about undocumented peoples here in the United States. If you aren't aware, DACA is basically this acronym. I forgot what it stands exactly for, but it basically is talking about people who have entered the United States as children, and so they are placed under sort of the safety net because in theory they didn't have like a choice in the matter, and so the idea is that they shouldn't be punished for that. But she realized like the way that the broader media talks about immigrants and immigration, and specifically undocumented immigrants, was basically on 2 ends of the spectrum. You either have the image of like these migrants crossing the border who are just like taking up resources and all of these other terrible stereotypes, or you have the other side of the spectrum where you have these like dreamers and like these people who are exceptional and things like that. And the author talks about in the beginning how there's this whole like middle section of people who are in the United States working hard and keeping their heads down and things like that, and you don't even realize like what they're going through, what their struggles are like, what their day-to-day lives are like. I really enjoyed this book. The way she structured this book I thought was really well done, because she basically takes like one topic or idea or struggle in regards to undocumented immigrants and talks about it basically on a little bit of a broader scale. One of the first sections talks about 9/11 and how there were a lot of undocumented immigrants who were basically hired as contractors to dig out through the ruins after 9/11 to try to find people. And she talks about how like they're dealing with so much afterwards, whether it's like PTSD or actual like illnesses due to like inhaling all of the smoke and soot and things like that. Another section talks about what it's like to be an undocumented immigrant and trying to get just like basic medication and the different avenues that you can turn to for that. This book is not very long, so I'm not going to like go through all of the different sections. I think it's kind of nice to explore them on your own, but honestly, this book is so well done. I understand now why everyone's been raving about it since it came out, and it definitely feels like it should be required reading because it gives you this glimpse into a group of people's lives who rarely have the spotlight on them for multiple reasons, partially because they don't want it on them because they're undocumented, and partially because as a society it's difficult to talk about topics that are complicated, and so we like the easy narratives, and this makes it so the narratives aren't easy. This is a book where the author inserts herself, and so she is very much a part of the story as well. She talks about her experiences, she talks about her parents and things along those lines. So if you're someone who doesn't like it when the author inserts themselves into a story, you won't enjoy this book. But personally, I really enjoyed it, especially because she's speaking with firsthand experience. And she talks about her own struggles and the way she views things and the things she wishes and all of this stuff. And I think that's an important part of the story as well. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. I would probably rate this like 4.5 stars. Next up, I read Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. This is a book that I checked out from the library. I actually had this as an ebook that I kept like getting as a hold and then never reading it and then re-going on the hold and re-getting it as an ebook from the library. And so this time around when it came and checked it out, I was like, okay, I'm going to read this book. So in the story, you are following this character named Finlay Donovan. She has recently gotten divorced. She is a writer and she takes care of her 2 kids who are both like basically under the age of 5, I think. Her life is basically in chaos. She is a mess, both personally and professionally. She's late on her latest novel. Her ex-husband is engaged to someone else and they seem to like have their lives perfectly together, and he's threatening to take custody of the kids. And so she writes like romantic mysteries, and she ends up meeting at a Panera with her agent, and she's talking about a book that she's working on when someone overhears her and thinks she's talking about the fact that she might be a hit woman. And so she gets slipped a note that basically says that this mysterious woman will pay Finlay Donovan around $50,000 in order to murder her husband. And hijinks ensue. Is this a good book? It depends on your definition of good. This was a really fun book to read. I did have to like turn my brain off while reading this book, so your mileage may vary on whether or not that's a good thing, because there are a lot of things in here that are either like really convenient or just like plot holes that you just can't look too hard at, otherwise it's really going to infuriate you. Like her sister is a police officer and she gets hit on by basically every guy she encounters and things along those lines. It's really over the top and really dramatic in kind of like a dramedy sort of way. Like if you've ever watched like Desperate Housewives or anything along those lines, like it gave me those sorts of vibes. Like if you're a fan of that TV show and you don't mind things that are kind of like really ridiculous and crazy, then you'll like this book, I think. It was really fun. It was really lighthearted. It's going to be a series and I might actually pick up the second book. I haven't decided yet. Like I feel like it'd be a really nice, fun sort of palate cleanser book. But again, you can't like stare too hard at it. Otherwise it will infuriate you. All right, next up, I finished Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck. This is one of the books that I listed as sort of like an extra book on my Nonfiction November TBR, but this was also one of the books that's like on my pile of books that I want to read before the end of the year. So I'm very excited to have that done. This is a collection of essays, and you are following John Steinbeck as he takes a road trip across the United States. So he starts in New York, which is where he lives at the time, and he travels across like the Midwest and the northern part of the United States, ends up in California, and then comes back around through the southern side. I really enjoyed this book. I was actually quite surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I mean, I knew I would like John Steinbeck's writing because I've read lots of John Steinbeck at this point, and I really enjoy the way that he writes. I think that in this book in particular, compared to basically the fiction that I've only read from him, you realize like how funny and witty and observant he is. And I think as someone living in the United States who has traveled to lots of different parts of the country, it was really fun to see Steinbeck's observation. So he talks a lot about sort of like road tripping and what you do and don't see. He comments on specific places and talks about his experiences there. He really wants to talk to people about like politics and what their preferences are and points of view are on things that are happening in the news and things along those lines. And it just was a really fun read because there's so much that he comments on in this book that you realize is still very much a thing today. He talks to one, I think it was a farmer, and they're talking about like things that are going on with Russia. This was published in like 1962, so you know that whole Cold War thing is like looming on everyone's minds. And so he's talking to someone about the Russians, and they were talking about the fact that like basically they learn everything so much faster and there's so much information coming at them that it's really hard for them to keep up, and how this farmer's grandfather really didn't have to pay attention to all this stuff and he could focus on the things of the farm, and that's really what his focus was. And Steinbeck just makes this comment about how information moves so much faster in the 1960s compared to when they were children, and human brains aren't meant to take information that quickly. They need more time in between in order to fully process it and to fully understand it. And it was just funny / interesting / wild that John Steinbeck was making that commentary or making that sort of observation in the 1960s. considering the world that we live in now, where we are constantly bombarded by the information, and it just makes you think about how much more exponentially that has gotten worse in our modern era compared to how it was in the 1960s. There are lots of like really beautiful observations about Wisconsin, which I took to heart because I lived in Wisconsin shortly because I went to college there. I will say there were like a couple of things in here that I think with a modern eye you notice. One of them is the fact that like this is 100% only a thing that a white man in the United States would be able to do in the 1960s. And throughout this entire book, I was thinking to myself how Steinbeck wasn't really commenting on the disparity there or like talking about people who were not white or anything along those lines. But he does do it at the very end. Once he starts traveling into the South, he starts discussing more openly his personal points of view. And obviously, like, there is some non-PC things, I think, that were said here. Nothing, like, terrible, but, like, you know, for the 1960s, it wasn't too bad, I suppose, but just a warning if you're going to read this. But he talks about how, like, specifically in New Orleans, he went to see these people called, like, the cheerleaders, who were these group of adults, specifically, I think they were women mostly, who went to the school to heckle a little black girl who was integrating a school. And he talked about like how terrible that experience was. He had heard about them and he wanted to go see it, but afterwards he basically regretted it. And he felt really, really disgusting. And so you see him reflecting on race a little bit towards the end of the book. But I don't necessarily love that it happened towards the end of the book. And also, as someone from Chicago, I also recognize the fact that like it's very like stereotypical to talk about race when talking about things in the South, which, yes, that's a thing, but also there's racism in the North and things like that. He reflects on the fact that like he considers himself open-minded and that growing up, he knew like one family in Salinas, California, which is where he grew up, that was a black family and how they were like well treated by the neighbors and things like that. And the entire time he was talking, I was like, they were the only black family in that town. I'm sure they have a very different point of view of what that experience was like. So yeah, there's like a little bit of that where it's just like, in my like modern eyes, I know that John Steinbeck has a skewed view of the United States because he's a white man. But I do appreciate the fact that he does touch on things that are still universally true, and he does like touch on things like race towards the end of the book. So yeah, I definitely really enjoyed this. I would probably rate this like a 3.5 star read for me because there are parts of the book where I was just like, I don't really care about what's happening here. He tells like these sometimes really long stories about conversations he had with people over the course of his trip, and I was just like, it's fine. But some of his observations are really wonderful and poignant and still true to this day, which is wild. All right, and the final book I have to talk about is A Spindle Splintered. That's really hard to say, by the way, by Alix Harrow. This is a tiny little novella that I was sent by Tor. Yes, Tor.com. And I really enjoyed this. I've never read anything by Alix Harrow before, but this is kind of like a Sleeping Beauty retelling, reimagining. And so I really enjoy fairy tale reimaginings. So I figured this would be a fun one to check out. You are following this character named Zinnia Gray, who is turning 21 years old, and this is supposed to be the last birthday that she's ever had because she has been diagnosed with a disease due to an industrial accident that happened in her town that affected a lot of different people. And so she has this rare condition where no one has ever lived past the age of 21, so she knows like her death is imminent. And also her diagnosis from her doctors and things like that at this point is that she has like weeks, not months left to live. And because she's been living with this disease for a number of years, she herself had become really obsessed with Sleeping Beauty, and so she's read a bunch of different iterations of the story and obviously loved the movie and from Disney and things like that, and she really loved the idea of this princess falling into a deep sleep, aka a coma. And so for her 21st birthday, her best friend Charm decides to have this big like experience for her, and she like brings her to a tower where she sets up this whole like Sleeping Beauty situation. And so there's even like a spinning wheel in the tower, and as a joke, Zinnia decides to prick her finger on the spinning wheel and she ends up passing out. And when she wakes up, she's in a different world in a castle with this princess named Primrose. And so she's basically been transported into the Sleeping Beauty world, and she has stopped Primrose, aka the Sleeping Beauty in this world, from pricking her finger on the spinning wheel and saving her life, basically. But then, you know, things kind of go haywire from there. And it won't say much more than that because, again, this is a pretty short book. Like, I read this entire thing in like a couple of hours, but this is a really fun read. Like, it's really interesting to see sort of how the author decided to play with the Sleeping Beauty idea. She references a bunch of different Sleeping Beauty retellings in this book, and so I found it really interesting as someone who doesn't really know too many Sleeping Beauty retellings, or actually doesn't know any besides the Disney one. So it's interesting to see sort of the different references that she makes, or the different examples that exist out there. And it's fun to see sort of like the twists and turns that take place in this book. I will say it's a really, really fun book. I honestly like really enjoyed my experience with this little novella. The ending requires quite a suspension of disbelief. There's a lot of like almost fourth wall breaking stuff happening in this book, but it's a novella and I found it to be fun overall. There's also like parts of this where I was just like, I needed to turn my brain off in order to enjoy it, because I was just like, will that actually work? You just have to like be willing to go for it. So if you just want something quick and fun and you enjoy fairy tale retellings, I feel like this is a good one to pick up. All right, so those are the 4 books that I have finished so far this month. In terms of what I'm currently reading, I don't know if I'll actually finish all of the books on my Nonfiction November TBR, but I feel like I'm making decent progress. I've been slowly working my way through Silver Sword and Stone. I'm only like 3 or 4 chapters into this because the chapters are thick and it's a lot of history. So I can't like read this book every day because my brain just doesn't have that capacity every day. So I pick it up when I can. And when I do, like reading a chapter takes me an hour or so because there's just a lot. But I really am enjoying this, and I can tell that the author has done a lot of research and the history of these different countries and things like that. So this is happening. And I've recently started White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. This is an essay collection, and I mean, I've only just barely started it, but from the introduction, I already like it. So I have pretty high hopes for this one. So these are the 2 I'm hoping to at minimum finish, but I have like a couple comics on my TBR and things like that. So I feel like these 2, interspersed with maybe a couple of other fiction books, I'll have a pretty rounded out end of the month wrap up and things like that. So yeah, I'm very happy with how my reading is going so far in November. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of the books that I've talked about here, or if you have any questions about any of the books, feel free to leave that down in the comment section as well. Or feel free to let me know how your reading has been going so far this month, especially if you are also participating in Nonfiction November. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.